Hello, and welcome back to Horror Stories Audio. For our returning listeners, thank you for stepping back into the shadows with us. Tonight, our story takes us to the shores of a remote lake, where a father and son search for solace but find a sound that should not exist, a lullaby that echoes from the past. Settle in and prepare yourself. If you enjoy the embrace of fear, consider liking this story and subscribing to the channel. It helps the darkness find others like us. The gravel road was a promise that had slowly deteriorated over the last 10 miles, a crumbling asphalt ribbon that finally gave up and dissolved into a bed of damp pine needles. I killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in to replace the low rumble was heavier than I remembered. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air, thick with the smell of damp earth and centuries of slow, quiet decay. This was it, Echo Lake. Through the windshield, the water was a sheet of dark, polished obsidian, perfectly mirroring the tall, imposing pines that stood around its edge like silent, watchful sentinels. The late afternoon sun broke through the canopy in tired, golden shafts, shattering into a million brilliant pieces on the surface. It was beautiful. So painfully, terribly beautiful. I forced a smile that felt like a crack in my face, turning to the passenger seat. "Well, we're here, buddy. Made it." Leo didn't answer, not at first. He just kept his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, his small finger tracing the outline of a crack in the reflection of a cloud, as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. He was 8. But in the last 6 months, he'd retreated into the quiet, lonely country of a much older man. His drawings at home had gone from brightly colored superheroes to small, gray figures standing in empty houses. This trip was my last desperate idea. Dr. Albright, with her calm, clinical optimism, had called it a change of scenery, a way to re-establish foundational bonds. I called it running away. We were running from a house that was no longer a home, but a museum of a life that had ended too soon, a collection of ghosts we politely stepped around each day. This place was supposed to be a sanctuary from those ghosts. It was supposed to be a happy memory. Maya had loved it here. I could see her so clearly it was an ache in my chest, standing on that very shore, skipping a stone that seemed to dance across the water a dozen times before sinking. She'd laughed, a sound like wind chimes, and the sunlight had caught the red in her hair. She was always humming here, always. It wasn't a tune from the radio, it was hers. A melody that twisted and turned in unexpected, gentle ways. A soft, intricate lullaby she'd pieced together from old folk songs she barely remembered her grandmother singing. "This one's a shield," she'd told me once, smiling as she rocked a sleeping Leo in her arms by a crackling fire. "It's to keep the bad dreams away." The memory was so sharp, so vivid, that for a half second I almost expected to see her when I looked at the shoreline, a phantom in flannel and hiking boots. But there was nothing. Only the trees, and the dark water, and the profound, crushing emptiness that had become my constant companion. The beauty I'd seen only moments ago now felt different, predatory. It was the beauty of a perfectly preserved photograph still, cold and utterly without life. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was watchful, expectant. The lake didn't look like glass now, but like a deep black eye staring up at the empty sky without blinking, its depths holding secrets I had no desire to learn. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air, a primal sense that we were intruders here, that we had stumbled into a place that was not meant for the living but for memories. And some memories, I was learning, had teeth. I unbuckled my seatbelt, the click unnaturally, loud. A mechanical intrusion in this organic silence. "Come on, Leo," I said, my voice sounding thin and foreign. "Let's go pick a spot. Just like we promised Mom we would." He finally peeled his face from the window, his eyes holding a familiar, heartbreaking vacancy. He gave a small, slow nod, a gesture of compliance rather than excitement, and we stepped out into the heavy, waiting silence of Echo Lake. The work began, as it always did, with the familiar rhythmic clatter of unloading gear from the trunk. I moved with a forced efficiency, a man trying to outrun his own thoughts by filling the air with activity. The tent bag, the cooler, the sleeping rolls, each item was a ghost of a past trip, a memory attached like a stubborn price tag. I pulled the folded nylon tent from its sack, the sound a loud whump in the quiet air. "How about right here, Chief?" I called out, my voice overly bright. "Nice flat spot. Got a 5-star view of the lake, right?" Leo had wandered to the water's edge, his back to me. He didn't turn around, just gave a slight shrug of his shoulders. I felt the manufactured cheerfulness drain out of me, leaving a hollow ache. It used to be a chaotic dance, setting up camp. Maya would direct, I would provide the muscle, and Leo would be the whirlwind, tripping over guy lines and trying to help by hiding the tent pegs. Now it was just a job. A lonely, silent one. I wrestled with the tent poles, the flexible fiberglass rods clicking together one by one. I remembered Maya laughing as I fumbled with this same tent a year ago, her hands guiding mine. Now, my fingers felt clumsy and stupid. A pole snagged in the nylon sleeve and I tugged too hard, a low curse escaping my lips. I immediately glanced over at Leo, but he hadn't noticed. His attention was entirely captivated by the dark, still water. He was crouched down now, his hand hovering just above the surface, as if feeling for a temperature that wasn't there. Once the tent was up a pocket, lopsided, sad-looking dome, it was time for firewood. "All right, mission time," I announced to the forest. "Operation Firewood. We need the driest, crackliest sticks you can find." I tried to make it sound like the old game, the adventure. Leo turned from the lake, his expression unchanged. He wandered into the tree line and came back a few minutes later with a single damp branch, which he dropped near the fire pit without a word before returning to his post by the water. I sighed, the sound swallowed by the woods, and spent the next 20 minutes gathering a proper pile myself. The fire caught eventually, a small, struggling flame that slowly grew into a confident blaze. It was the one thing that felt right, the warmth pushing back against the encroaching chill of the evening. It cast long, dancing shadows that writhed and twisted at the edge of the woods, making the familiar shapes of trees seem alien and menacing. I set about preparing our dinner. Hot dogs on sticks, the quintessential camping meal. The smell of the roasting meat was supposed to be comforting, a scent of pure nostalgia. But the silence between us was so absolute that the sound of our own chewing seemed deafening, an ugly, wet noise in the pristine quiet. I tried to bridge the chasm. How's Mr. Henderson's class? Still doing the thing with the planets?" Leo poked the fire with his stick, sending a shower of sparks into the twilight. "It's okay." 2 words. In the last 10 minutes, that was a conversational marathon. I tried again. "See any cool birds today? Or a chipmunk?" He shook his head, his eyes never leaving the now black surface of the lake. He seemed to be listening for something, waiting. The normalcy I had been trying so hard to build felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. It was all wrong. The silence, the woods, the way my son stared at the water as if it held all the answers I couldn't give him. This wasn't healing. It was just a different kind of quiet, a different kind of empty. And as the last of the sunlight died behind the peaks, I felt a deep, gnawing certainty that we were not alone here, and that whatever was watching us had been here for a very, very long time. The sun began its slow, bleeding descent behind the jagged black peaks that ringed the far side of the lake. The sky, which had been a clear, hopeful blue, was now bruised with deepening shades of purple and a violent arterial orange. The light didn't just fade, it was drained from the world, and the shadows that had been long and distinct now lost their edges, pooling together into a single, rising tide of darkness that crept from the tree line towards our small, lonely fire. The temperature dropped with an almost theatrical suddenness, the air growing teeth. I hugged my arms around my chest, telling myself it was just the evening chill, a normal mountain phenomenon. But it wasn't just the cold, something else was changing. I strained my ears, listening for the familiar evening symphony of the wilderness. The chirping of crickets, the deep, guttural thrum of bullfrogs, the call of a whip poor will. There was nothing. The silence from the afternoon had deepened, solidifying into something unnervingly absolute. It wasn't empty. It felt curated, as if every living creature in this valley had made a collective, silent agreement to hold its breath. I was a man who had spent a good portion of his life in the outdoors, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in my gut, that this kind of total silence was profoundly wrong. Nature is never truly quiet. I scanned the dark wall of pines that surrounded us, then the motionless, inky surface of the lake. Everything was perfectly still, like a painting. A beautiful, dead painting. The fire crackled and spat, the sound offensively loud in the vacuum, a desperate little heartbeat in a vast, unliving body. I felt an irrational urge to shush it, to not draw attention to ourselves. It was Leo who finally broke the spell, his small voice cutting through the oppressive quiet. He hadn't moved from his spot by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light. He was still looking at the lake. "Dad," he asked, his voice soft and serious, "why is the lake so sad?" The question hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, so childish, yet it gave a name to the very thing I was feeling but couldn't articulate. Sad. That was it. This place wasn't angry or evil. It was steeped in a deep, ancient, and overwhelming sorrow. I stared at my son, at his pale, earnest face, and I had no answer. How could I tell him that I agreed? How could I tell him that the sadness felt so profound it felt like it might just swallow us whole? I couldn't. I was the dad. I was the shield. So I did what I had been doing for the last 6 months. I performed. "Sad? No way, buddy," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded like cracking wood. "This lake isn't sad. It's just shy. Very, very shy. You know the story of Paul Bunyan, the giant lumberjack?" Leo shook his head. "Well, a long, long time ago, this whole place was just flat. And Paul's giant blue ox, Babe, was thirsty. So Paul took his giant axe and he swung it so hard into the ground that it made this huge hole. And the water that filled it was so surprised it's been quiet ever since." I kept talking, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness, piling on ridiculous details about giant squirrels and fish that could yodel. I was a desperate comedian playing to a dead room, the silence my only audience. And with every word of my stupid, cheerful story, the feeling of dread grew stronger. I could feel the darkness at my back, could feel the cold gaze of the water, could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on the fragile bubble of our firelight. I was telling a story about a friendly giant, but my mind was screaming at me that there were other, older things in these woods, things that were not friendly at all. I finally trailed off, my story ending with a weak, pathetic punchline that neither of us laughed at. The silence rushed back in to fill the void, heavier than before. Leo hadn't looked away from the lake. He just gave a small, slow nod, as if considering my story and finding it lacking. He didn't seem comforted. He seemed to be listening to a different story altogether, one being told by the sad black water. And I knew, with a certainty that made the hairs on my arms stand up, that we had made a terrible, terrible mistake by coming here. The fire had surrendered hours ago, collapsing into a bed of pulsing orange embers that did little to fight off the encroaching absolute black of the forest night. We were zipped inside the tent, two isolated heartbeats in a vast and indifferent wilderness. The thin nylon walls, illuminated by the low, battery-powered glow of a small lantern, seemed impossibly fragile, a pathetic shield against the immense silent world outside. I could hear every rustle of Leo's sleeping bag, every soft breath he took. He'd been quiet for a long time, and I hoped, with a desperate prayer, that he was finally asleep. I was not. I lay on my back, staring at the meaningless shadows dancing on the tent's ceiling, my mind a frantic race of regrets and anxieties. The trip was a mistake. I hadn't healed anything. I had only found a new, more profound venue for our shared grief. The image of Leo staring at the lake, the sadness in his question, it all churned within me. I was failing him. I was failing Maya. My grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe the cold, thin air. And then I heard it. It began so faintly that at first, I was sure it was just the ringing in my ears, or perhaps the blood pumping too hard past my eardrums. A high, thin, musical note that seemed to hang in the air just beyond the range of normal sound. I held my breath, listening. It wasn't the wind. The wind was a sigh, a rustle. This was a presence, a deliberate, structured sound. The notes began to link together, forming a melody that drifted across the black water from some impossible distance. It wasn't coming from a speaker. It was too pure for that, too organic. It was the sound of a human voice. My heart began a slow, heavy drum beat against my ribs. My first thought, a desperate grasp at logic, was another camper. But the park ranger had been explicit. We were the only permit holders for the Echo Lake Basin for the next 3 days. There was no one else for miles. A lone hiker, perhaps? Lost and singing to themselves? The thought died as the melody became clearer, weaving its way through the thin fabric of the tent and directly into my soul. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. It wasn't just a lullaby. It was the lullaby, Maya's song. I could hear every unique, gentle turn of the melody, every place her voice would rise and fall. It was the song she had hummed while sketching by this very lake. It was the song she had whispered into Leo's hair to chase away nightmares. It was a melody that existed in only 3 places on Earth: in her memory, in mine, and in our son's. And one of those was now buried under 6 feet of cold, hard dirt. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. My mind scrambled, trying to build a wall of reason against an impossible flood. It had to be a coincidence. A trick of the mind. Auditory pareidolia, that's what it was called. The brain finding patterns in random noise. We had been thinking about her, so my grief was simply projecting itself onto the sound of the wind. "Dad?" Leo's voice, small and clear from the darkness beside me, shattered my frantic rationalizations. He wasn't asleep. He had been listening too. "That's Mommy's song." His voice wasn't filled with fear, but with a simple, pure, and utterly terrifying wonder. He rustled in his sleeping bag, turning to face me. "Is Mommy singing?" Every protective instinct in my body screamed at once. I looked at the shape of my son, a small lump in the lantern's dim glow, and I knew I had to lie. I had to build a fortress around him, even if I was crumbling inside. I pushed my own terror down, deep down, and forced my voice to be steady. "No, buddy," I whispered, reaching over to pat his shoulder. "That's just the wind. You know how it whistles through the pine needles? Sometimes, if you listen just right, it can sound like a song." He was quiet for a moment. The beautiful, impossible music continued to drift in from the darkness outside. "It sounds like her," he said, his voice small. "I know," I said, my throat tight. "That's because we miss her so much. Our brains are just playing tricks on us because we're tired." I held my breath, praying he would accept it. After a long moment, he shifted back over. "Okay, Dad." I listened as his breathing slowly deepened back towards sleep. But I remained wide awake, my eyes locked on the thin nylon wall of our tent. The lullaby continued for another 10 minutes before it slowly, gently faded away, leaving behind a silence that was 1,000 times more horrifying than the sound had been. I was alone in the dark, with a truth I couldn't accept and a fear so profound it felt like the cold, final stillness of a grave. Sleep did not come. The first night was a long, cold vigil spent listening to the silence, my ears straining for a sound that I both dreaded and desperately needed to hear again just to prove I hadn't imagined it. But the lullaby did not return. The following day was a masterpiece of forced normalcy. I initiated a hike. I pointed out different types of trees. I even tried to teach Leo how to skip stones, just as Maya had. But my heart wasn't in it. Every action was a performance. Every cheerful word a lie. My senses were stretched to a breaking point. Every gust of wind sounded like the start of a melody. Every shadow in the woods seemed to hold a waiting shape. Leo remained quiet, but I would occasionally catch him humming unconsciously the first few notes of his mother's song. Each time, a jolt of ice would shoot through my veins. As dusk fell on that second day, the dread returned with a vengeance, a physical sickness that settled in my stomach. I built the fire bigger this time, a roaring, defiant blaze against the encroaching dark. We ate in near silence, and I hurried us both into the tent as soon as the last light had gone, as if the thin nylon walls offered any real protection. Leo, exhausted from the day's anxious energy, was asleep within minutes. But I was more awake than I had ever been. I lay in my sleeping bag, the heavy-duty flashlight clutched in my hand, its cold, metallic weight a pathetic comfort. I was waiting. It began near midnight. There was no gentle fade-in this time, no ambiguity. One moment there was silence, the next, the lullaby was there, hanging in the cold, clear air. It was sharper, purer, as if the singer was no longer on the far side of the lake but standing just at the water's edge, directly across from our campsite. The beautiful, heartbreaking melody was the same, but now, woven within it, I could hear words. They weren't Maya's lyrics about sleepy bears and friendly moons. It was a single, simple phrase, repeated over and over in a voice that was both achingly sweet and terrifyingly hollow. "I'm so lonely. Come to me. I'm so lonely. Come to me." The wall of denial I had spent all day trying to rebuild was not just breached. It was obliterated. This was not the wind. This was not grief. This was real. A cold, furious terror, different from the shock of the night before, surged through me. It was the primal animal fear of a cornered prey. My first instinct was a fierce, protective rage. I looked over at Leo, a still lump in his sleeping bag, his breathing deep and even. He wasn't stirring. For some reason, tonight, he couldn't hear it. Or maybe it wasn't meant for him. I couldn't just lie here. I couldn't hide. The rage and fear coalesced into a single desperate need to see. My hands shaking, I slowly, carefully began to pull down the zipper on the tent's flap. The sound was a metallic shriek in the quiet, a violent tearing of the night. I froze, listening. The singing didn't falter. It continued its serene, horrible invitation. I slipped out of the tent, my bare feet instantly numb on the cold, damp earth. The music was all around me now, a tangible thing that made the air vibrate. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely aim the flashlight. I thumbed the switch, and a powerful, clean beam of white light cut a path through the oppressive darkness. I swept it left, illuminating the impassive, twisted shapes of the pines. I swept it right, across the dead embers of our fire and the dark, silent trees beyond. Nothing. There was nothing. Then, with my heart hammering against my ribs, I aimed the beam forward, out across the black, glassy surface of the lake towards the source of the sound. The instant the beam of light touched the water, the singing stopped. It didn't fade. It didn't trail off. It was cut, sharply and suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped. A plug had been pulled. The silence that rushed back was no longer empty. It was a loaded, intelligent thing. It was the silence of something that had been caught. It knew I was here. It knew I was looking. And it knew that I knew. That single, impossible interaction, an action, and an immediate intelligent reaction broke something deep inside me. The last vestiges of my courage, of my sanity, simply snapped. A strangled gasp escaped my lips as I stumbled backward, scrambling back into the tent and fumbling frantically with the zipper. True panic, hot and suffocating, flooded my entire being. I was trapped, miles from help, with my son, and a thinking, watching, singing thing was out there in the dark, waiting. My breath came in ragged, silent gasps, a frantic, useless effort to pull air into lungs that felt like they were being squeezed in a vice. Cold sweat slicked my skin, and a violent tremor took hold of my body, a vibration that started in my bones and radiated outward. I was a mess of pure animal terror. My world shrunk to the suffocating confines of the tent. My mind was a white-hot scream, replaying the moment the music had been so intelligently, so deliberately cut short. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a conversation. And I had just hung up the phone on something ancient and terrible. My entire focus was on the thin nylon barrier between me and it, every fiber of my being listening for the sound of a footstep, a scratch, a breath. In the midst of my silent, spiraling panic, a sound from inside the tent jolted me with a fresh spike of adrenaline. It was the soft, whispering rustle of a sleeping bag. I turned my head, my neck muscles screaming in protest. The lantern cast a weak, sickly yellow glow, and in it, I saw Leo. He was sitting bolt upright. His movement had been slow, fluid, and utterly silent, like a marionette being pulled by unseen strings. He wasn't looking at me. His small, still form was oriented towards the front of the tent, towards the lake. His eyes were wide open, but they weren't focused. They were looking through the nylon, through the trees, out into the impenetrable darkness beyond. And there was no fear on his face. None. In its place was a look of serene, placid concentration, a deep and unnerving calm that was 1,000 times more terrifying than any scream would have been. A part of my terrified brain tried to latch on to a logical explanation. Sleepwalking. He was just sleepwalking. Leo? I whispered, my voice a dry, cracking thing. Hey buddy, what's wrong? You had a bad dream? I started to reach for him, to gently push him back down into the warmth of his sleeping bag, to restore the order of the world where children slept soundly through the night. He spoke before I could touch him, his voice as calm and flat as the surface of the lake. It stopped. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. His head tilted slightly. You scared her away, Dad. The blood in my veins seemed to stop moving. The air in my lungs solidified. Scared. Scared who away, Leo? I managed to stammer, my own panic feeling distant and unimportant now, replaced by a new and colder dread. He finally turned his face towards me, and his eyes, empty of any childish light, found mine in the dim glow. There was no emotion in them at all. No love, no fear, not even curiosity. They were just looking. Mommy, he said, the single word delivered with a hollow finality. She was singing for me. Mommy is calling me. And with those 5 words, the entire landscape of my fear was redrawn. The terror I had felt moments ago, the primal fear of the monster in the dark, the ghost in the woods, seemed simple, almost naive. It was a selfish fear, a fear for my own life, my own sanity. This was infinitely worse. This was the soul-shattering terror that only a parent can know. The lullaby wasn't a random haunting. The presence out there wasn't just a spirit. It was a predator. And the beautiful sacred memory of my dead wife was not a shield. It was the bait. It was a hook, and it was being dangled in the dark water to catch my son. The monster wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to lure Leo out. The supernatural horror of it all became secondary to the raw, biological imperative that screamed through my body. The fear of losing my son, of having him stolen from me by this thing that wore my wife's memory like a mask, eclipsed everything else. My trembling stopped, replaced by a rigid, cold focus. The blind panic sharpened into the diamond-hard edge of a father's protective rage. I was no longer afraid of what was outside the tent. I was terrified of what it wanted, with what was inside. My hands were clamped on Leo's small shoulders, trying to gently but firmly guide him back down into his sleeping bag. It was like trying to move a statue. He didn't resist with any real force. But there was an unnerving, placid weight to him, his entire being focused on the thin nylon wall that separated us from the lake. Hiding in here, listening, waiting for the next phase of this psychological assault. It was a losing strategy. The entity out there was patient. It had time. We did not. A cold, hard realization settled in my gut. Cowering in the dark was a form of surrender. It was letting the monster dictate the terms of engagement. The fear for my son was a fire that burned away the last of my passive terror, forging it into something else, something sharp and active. I had to see it. I had to face it. I had to know what was trying to steal my son. "Stay here, Leo," I whispered, my voice low and hard, a tone I hadn't used since Maya's death. "Do not, for any reason, unzip this tent. Do you understand me?" For the first time, he seemed to register my presence. He turned his head from the wall and looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant in the lantern light. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. I took it as the only assurance I was going to get. I zipped the flap tight, plunged the tent into darkness by switching off the lantern, and then, with my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I unzipped the main flap and stepped back out into the night. The world outside was transformed. The clouds had cleared, and a brilliant, almost full moon hung in the black sky, bathing the entire basin in a sterile silver light. Everything was rendered in shades of black and bone white. The trees were jagged ink blots, and the lake was a vast, polished mirror of liquid moonlight. The fire was a cold, black circle of ash. I stood there, a lone, breathing figure in a silent, monochromatic world, my own breath pluming in the frigid air. The silence was absolute. I stood and watched. The water, my eyes scanning the shimmering surface, my entire body a single, taut nerve of anticipation. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The cold began to seep into my bones. A sliver of doubt, of hope, tried to wedge its way into my mind. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had scared it away. Maybe it was all just a terrible, shared nightmare. And then, it began again. The lullaby. It didn't drift on the wind this time. It felt as though it was rising from the water itself. A song born from the cold, black depths. It was clearer than before, achingly beautiful, the notes perfectly formed and pure. It was a siren's song, aimed not at me, but at the tent behind me. It was calling for my son, I held my ground, my feet frozen to the spot, my eyes locked on the shimmering path the moonlight cut across the lake's surface. I followed that path out to the center of the lake, and that's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flaw in the reflection, a slight distortion in the silver light, a smudge of darkness where there should have been only water. I squinted, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were telling it. The smudge resolved itself, coalescing into a shape. It was the tall, slender silhouette of a woman. She was standing, impossibly, on the surface of the water, her form indistinct and shimmering as if viewed through a heat haze. I couldn't make out a face or features, only the undeniable shape of a person where no person could possibly be. I stared, my breath caught in my throat. The part of my brain that still clung to the rules of the world screamed that it was a trick of the light, a log, a reflection. But my heart knew better. This was it. The source. The singer. The thing that was wearing my wife's memory. The sight of it, so serene and so utterly impossible, was a profound violation of reality. I wasn't going crazy. This was real. As I watched, paralyzed, the shimmering head seemed to turn, its featureless face orienting toward the shore, toward the tent where my son was sleeping. That single, subtle movement broke the spell. The image of that thing's attention on Leo ignited a rage so pure and white-hot it burned through my terror. A sound was torn from my throat, a raw, ragged bellow that was more animal than human. "Leave him alone." The instant my voice shattered the silence, the figure vanished. It didn't run, it didn't sink. It simply dissolved, like a wisp of smoke caught in a breeze, gone in the space of a heartbeat. The lullaby was severed mid-note. The lake was once again a perfect, unbroken mirror of silver and black. I was left standing there, my desperate shout echoing once off the far peaks before being swallowed by the profound waiting silence. I was shaking violently, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the aftershock of a reality that had been irrevocably broken. There was no going back. The fight was real, and it had just begun. There was no more sleep. The rest of the night was a long, tense ordeal spent sitting bolt upright in the suffocating darkness of the tent, my arm slung protectively over Leo's sleeping form. I held the heavy flashlight like a weapon, my thumb resting on the switch, ready to flood the world with light at the slightest sound. But no sound came. The silence that followed my shout was absolute, a heavy, malevolent void that felt more threatening than the song had. It was the silence of something intelligent, something that was now watching and waiting and thinking. The moment the first weak, gray light of dawn began to seep through the thin nylon, I was moving. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, was afire in my veins. There was no gentle waking, no quiet moment to greet the day. I shook Leo's shoulder, my movements rough and urgent. "Leo, get up," I said, my voice a harsh whisper. "Get your shoes on. We're leaving. Now." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, his face a mask of sleepy confusion. "What? Why? It's still dark." "Now, Leo," I repeated, my voice, leaving no room for argument. I didn't have time for explanations that I didn't have, for reassurances that I couldn't give. My only focus was the car. The car was safety. The car was civilization. The car was the way out of this living nightmare. I began to tear down our campsite with a frantic, desperate energy. The sleeping bags were jammed into their compression sacks with brutal force. The tent poles were collapsed with a series of angry clicks. I didn't bother folding the tent itself. I just bundled the thin fabric into a messy, sprawling ball and shoved it into its bag. Everything was a clumsy, fumbling mess, my shaking hands betraying the calm I was trying to project. We abandoned the site like fleeing refugees, leaving behind a still smoldering fire pit and spilled coffee grounds. I grabbed Leo's hand, my grip probably too tight, and practically pulled him towards the spot where the trail had met our clearing. The morning air was crisp and clean, the sky was lightening to a pale, hopeful blue, and the lake, to my right, looked serene and beautiful in the dawn light. It was a perfect, peaceful morning, a grotesque and mocking contrast to the chaotic terror that was consuming me. I kept my eyes fixed forward, on the spot in the tree line where salvation lay. We reached it, and we stopped. I stared, my frantic momentum coming to a dead halt. There was nothing there. Where there had been a clear, well-trodden path of dark earth and flattened pine needles just a day before, there was now an impassable wall of wilderness. A dense, tangled barricade of thorny bushes, thick ferns, and young saplings stood crowded together, their branches interlaced like the bars of a cage. It wasn't just overgrown. It looked ancient, undisturbed, as if no human foot had ever stepped there. This isn't the spot," I stammered, my voice thin. I must have gotten turned around. I let go of Leo's hand and pushed forward, forcing my way into the brush. Thorny vines snagged at my clothes and tore at my skin. The path had to be here. It had to be. I thrashed through the undergrowth for 10, 20 feet, my desperation growing with every step. But there was nothing. Just more trees, more thorns, more unyielding, untouched forest. It hadn't been covered up. It had been erased. A raw, primal panic began to claw its way up my throat. I stumbled back into the clearing, my mind scrambling for a tool, any tool of logic. The compass. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled it out, holding the brass instrument in my trembling palm. I held it flat, waiting for the needle to settle, to give me a direction, an anchor in this chaotic world. The red needle swung lazily, then spun in a slow, complete circle, then another. It was useless. A toy, its connection to the fundamental laws of the planet severed. My last hope. The phone. I pulled it from my other pocket, praying for a single bar of signal, a miracle. The screen glowed to life, displaying the familiar, damning words. No signal. Of course. But I had the offline map. The GPS. I opened the app. The small blue dot that represented us pulsed on the screen. It was there. But it was floating in a vast, featureless sea of green. The trail wasn't there. Even the shape of the lake itself seemed wrong, its familiar contours distorted. The technology that had mapped and tamed the world was blind here. It was just another useless trinket. I sank to my knees, the dead compass in one hand and the useless phone in the other. I looked at the impenetrable wall of green that had once been our way out. I looked at my son, who stood watching me, his face pale with a confusion that was rapidly turning to fear. The frantic energy, the adrenaline of the morning's desperate flight, all of it evaporated, replaced by a cold, heavy, and crushing certainty. We weren't just lost. To be lost, there must be a path somewhere to be found. We were trapped. The forest, the lake, this entire beautiful, sad place it was. A prison. And it had just sealed the only door. For a long time I just knelt there on the damp earth, the useless compass in one hand and the dead phone in the other. They were relics from a world of logic and order, a world that no longer existed here. The frantic energy had bled out of me, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. Hope was a fragile thing, and the sight of that impassable wall of green had crushed it completely. My mind felt blank, wiped clean by a wave of pure, abject despair. We were trapped. The words echoed in the empty space of my skull, a simple, terrible truth. The world was a muted, meaningless blur. It was the need to explain this failure, this new terrible reality to my son, that finally pierced through the fog of my shock. I had to tell him something. I had to look him in the eye and pretend I had a plan. With a groan, I pushed myself up, my knees stiff and sore, and turned around to face him. The space where he had been standing was empty. My brain didn't process it at first. I scanned the clearing, my eyes skipping over the spot where he should have been, expecting to find him a few feet to the left or right, perhaps crouched down examining a rock. But there was nothing. Just the messy campsite, the cold fire pit, and the silent watching trees. "Leo?" I called out, my voice quiet, laced with a tired annoyance. "Come on, buddy. This isn't the time for hide and seek." Silence. A cold prickle of unease started in the base of my spine and spread upwards. He wouldn't. Not now. He knew this was serious. I walked quickly back to the tent, my heart starting a low, nervous rhythm. I ripped open the flap. "Leo?" The tent was empty, a jumble of sleeping bags and discarded clothes. My breath hitched. I circled the small clearing, my pace quickening, my eyes darting into the shadows between the trees. "Okay, Leo, you made your point. Game over. Come on out." My voice was louder now, a brittle edge of panic creeping into it. I pushed into the tree line in the opposite direction of the lake, slapping away branches, my eyes scanning the forest floor for a footprint, a sign, a flash of his red jacket. Nothing. The woods were still and empty. The annoyance was gone, completely consumed by a rising tide of raw, undiluted fear. It was a physical thing, a tightening in my chest, a sour taste in the back of my throat. He was just here. He was just here. He couldn't have gone far. "Leo!" I screamed his name, all pretense of calm gone, the sound raw and torn from my throat. "Leo, where are you?" My voice echoed once, a desperate, ugly sound that the forest swallowed without a trace. I yelled again and again, my throat burning, my voice cracking with terror. I thrashed through the undergrowth, a wild animal searching for its young, calling his name until I was hoarse. Finally, I stopped, bent over, my hands on my knees, sucking in ragged gulps of air. I stood in the dead center of the clearing and listened, every nerve in my body screaming, praying for a reply, a cry, a whimper, the snap of a twig, anything. And the forest gave me nothing. The silence that answered my shouts was the most profound and terrifying emptiness I had ever known. It was the silence of a void, the silence of a world that had never contained a small boy named Leo at all. In that moment of absolute soul-crushing silence, my hope didn't just die. It was ripped out of me, leaving a gaping, bleeding wound. Then, breaking that perfect, terrible silence, a single, clear note hung in the air. Another followed, and then another, weaving together into a melody that was now burned into my soul. The lullaby. It started again, drifting from the one direction I hadn't dared to look. It came from the lake. It wasn't menacing this time. It wasn't a sorrowful whisper. It was gentle. It was serene. It was calm and beautiful and filled with a sense of triumphant, maternal welcome. I froze, my frantic search ending as if my muscles had turned to stone. I slowly, mechanically, turned my body to face the water. The sun was higher now, and the lake was a placid, sparkling sheet of blue, impossibly beautiful. And from its calm, sunlit surface, the song of my dead wife was being offered up into the clean morning air. It was no longer a haunting. It was a taunt. It was a receipt. It was a victory song. And I knew, with a certainty so absolute it felt like the stopping of my own heart, that the monster had my son. For a moment that stretched into an eternity. I was a statue of hollowed-out terror, rooted to the spot by the sheer triumphant beauty of that sound. And then, something deep inside me, Something primal and paternal broke. The despair shattered, and a white-hot singular purpose roared into its place. Get him back. My paralysis broke. I didn't just run. I launched myself forward, a desperate, adrenaline-fueled sprint back towards the water's edge. Branches whipped at my face, stones turned under my feet, but I felt nothing. The world narrowed into a frantic, shaking tunnel, and at the end of it was the source of that impossible music. As I ran, the quality of the lullaby began to change. The gentle, triumphant tone bled away, replaced by something else. The melody was the same, but it was now saturated with an ancient, profound sorrow. It was a sound of weeping, of unbearable loss, a beautiful and terrible lament that didn't just enter my ears but seemed to vibrate deep inside my bones. It was no longer a song of victory. It was the hypnotic, irresistible summons of a shared grief, a promise of an end to all pain. I burst through the last line of trees onto the stony shore, my lungs burning, and the sight before me stole the air from them completely. Leo was in the water. He wasn't swimming or playing. He was walking slowly and deliberately out into the depths of the lake. The water was already up to his waist, his small form moving with a calm, steady purpose, his steps perfectly in time with the rhythm of the sorrowful music. His head was up, his face aimed toward the center of the lake, his expression as placid and empty as it had been in the tent. He was a sleepwalker, a puppet, being drawn forward by invisible strings of melody. And out on the water, waiting for him, was the figure. It was clearer now in the bright morning light. It wasn't solid, but a shimmering, vaguely translucent thing, a form woven from heat, haze, and moonlight and grief. It had the definite shape of a tall, slender woman, her long, dark hair seeming to bleed into the water around her, her form wavering as if she were a reflection on a disturbed surface. I could not see a face, but I could feel a gaze, an ancient and patient attention fixed entirely on my son. She wasn't moving toward him. She didn't have to. She was simply waiting, her presence the source of the hypnotic pull, the quiet epicenter of the song. "Leo!" I screamed his name, my voice raw and cracking. He didn't react. He didn't even flinch. It was as if he couldn't hear me, as if the only sound in his world was the haunting music. Without a second thought, I plunged into the lake after him, the shocking, biting cold of the water a jolt to my system. The icy water soaked my jeans, dragging at my legs, but I pushed forward, my eyes locked on my son's small, retreating back. And as the frigid water swirled around my waist, the impossible scene before me, the entranced child, the shimmering woman, the sorrowful song triggered something deep in the recesses of my memory. It was a stupid, trivial thing. A flash of an image from weeks ago, back in the world of fluorescent lights and coffee-stained countertops. I was at the kitchen table, planning this very trip, half-heartedly flipping through a cheap, glossy tourist brochure for the Northwoods region. My mind had been on work, on bills, on the crushing logistics of being a single parent, but a small, boxed-off paragraph at the bottom of a page, next to a cartoonish drawing of a ghost, had snagged my attention for a fleeting second. I had read it, dismissed it as silly local folklore, and forgotten it until now. The words of the brochure bloomed in my mind with horrifying, perfect clarity. Local legends. Beware the weeping spirit of Echo Lake. As the story goes, a pioneer woman lost her only child to the icy waters over a century ago. Driven mad by grief, she drowned herself in the same spot. Now, they say her sorrowful spirit waits, forever humming the lullaby she can no longer sing to her own child, sometimes luring other lost children into the cold embrace of the water to replace the one she lost. It all clicked into place. The beautiful sadness of the place, the focus on Leo, the lullaby. It wasn't Maya's song being stolen. It was the spirit's song, a lament of her own loss, and it was using the shape of our grief, the specific sacred memory of Maya's tune, as a key to unlock my son's heart. It was a predator that customized its lure. I stopped waiting, standing waist deep in the freezing water, the cold forgotten. I was no longer just fighting a monster. I was fighting a mother's grief, a grief that had festered in this cold, dark water for 100 years and had finally found the perfect target. I knew what it was, and I knew exactly what it wanted. The cold of the lake was a physical shock, a brutal anchor to the horrifying reality of the moment. I stood waist deep in the icy water, my legs numb, my teeth chattering. Ahead of me, Leo continued his slow, inexorable march into the depths, the sorrowful lullaby wrapping around him like a shroud. The shimmering figure waited, patient and serene. My first instinct was to scream, to charge, to physically wrestle my son back from the edge of the abyss. But the brochure's words echoed in my mind. A sorrowful spirit. This wasn't a creature of flesh and blood that could be fought. Its hooks weren't in Leo's body. They were in his heart, in his memory. Force would be useless. The battle had to be fought on its turf. The spirit was offering him a perfect, beautiful memory, a mother's song. To break its hold, I had to fight that perfect lie with the messy, imperfect, and beautiful truth. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the frigid air burning my lungs. I didn't shout his name. Shouting was for panic. This required something else. I spoke, my voice low and steady, willing it to cut through the hypnotic music, to find the real Leo buried beneath the spell. Leo, I said, my voice trembling but clear. Do you remember your mom's laugh? I don't mean the polite one she used for strangers. I mean the real one. The goofy, loud snort she did when she laughed too hard at a cartoon. For a split second, the ethereal music seemed to falter, a single note wavering. Leo's steady, rhythmic pace hitched for just a moment. It was enough. It was a crack in the illusion. I pressed on, my own memories now my only weapon. Remember how she always burned the first pancake? Every single Sunday, I said, my voice growing stronger, warmer. She'd hold it up with the spatula, all black and smoking, and call it the pancake sacrifice for the gods. And you'd giggle so hard you'd get milk in your nose. Do you remember that, buddy? Leo stopped walking. He stood there, the water swirling around his small chest, his head tilted as if listening to two different songs at once. The lullaby continued, but it was strained now, its perfect melody fighting against the intrusion of my words. The shimmering figure on the water seemed to flicker, its form less stable. Remember the little white scar above her eyebrow? I continued, wading a step closer. She told you she got it fighting a dragon, but she really got it falling off her bicycle when she was a kid. She was so clumsy, wasn't she? Always bumping into doorways. And remember how much she hated the smell of coffee? Hated it. But she made it for me every single morning just because she knew I loved it. She'd hold her nose the whole time. That was her, Leo. Not just a song. She was goofy and clumsy and real. Each memory was a stone thrown into the still, hypnotic water, sending out ripples of truth that disturbed the perfect surface of the lie. The lullaby was becoming discordant, notes souring as the figure of the woman wavered more violently, its beautiful illusion struggling to hold. Leo slowly turned his head. His eyes were still distant, but there was a flicker of confusion in them now, a hint of the real boy fighting his way back. I knew I had to deliver the final, killing blow. I had to use the one memory that was the absolute antithesis of what this creature was offering. I took another step, the icy water a numbing pain around my ribs. She wouldn't want you in the water, Leo, I said, my voice thick with a raw, painful honesty. She wouldn't be calling you in. The last thing she ever said to me. In the hospital, she made me promise, she said. Don't let our boy forget me, David. But don't let him live inside a memory either. Find new places. Make new memories. She knew she was leaving, buddy, and she wanted us to live. She wanted you to be warm and safe and to keep living. A memory is a beautiful place, but it's not a home. It's not real. That thing out there, that's not her. Your mom wouldn't trap you. She would set you free. The truth of those final words spoken into the cold mountain air was a cannon blast. The beautiful, sorrowful lullaby didn't just falter. It shattered, dissolving into a discordant, ugly shriek of pure rage and grief. Leo blinked, a violent shudder running through his small body as if waking from a long, deep sleep. The trance was broken. He looked around, at the cold water, at me, his eyes wide with confusion and a dawning, terrible fear. The fight for his mind was over. My final words hung in the frigid air, a declaration of truth against a century-old lie. For a single, suspended moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Leo stood frozen, the vacant look in his eyes replaced by a flicker of dawning, horrified recognition. He was looking at me, truly seeing me for the first time since this nightmare began. The connection, the bond I had been so desperate to reestablish, was forged again in this crucible of terror. And that bond was a weapon. The lullaby, robbed of its hypnotic power, fractured. The beautiful, serene melody collapsed in on itself, devolving into a sound of pure, agonizing failure. It was the sound of a beautiful porcelain doll shattering on a stone floor, of a vinyl record being violently scratched, of a perfect voice cracking into a raw, ugly sob. The notes became a discordant, chaotic mess of noise, a symphony of grief and rage that clawed at the air before finally mercifully dying into silence. As the last ugly note faded, the figure on the water began to dissolve. It wasn't a quick vanishing act like the night before. This was a slow, gruesome, and deliberate decay. The shimmering, beautiful form of the woman began to peel away, sloughing off like wet paper, her ethereal glow dimming to a sickly phosphorescent green. The illusion of grace and beauty ran like watercolor in the rain, revealing the horrific truth that lay beneath. What was left was a thing of ancient, waterlogged sorrow. It was gaunt, emaciated, its form unnaturally tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was the pale, mottled gray of a river stone, slick and seemingly translucent. Long, tangled hair, the color of black seaweed, clung to its skeletal frame. But the face was the true horror. It was recognizably human, but it had been hollowed out by 100 years of ceaseless grief. The cheeks sunken, the mouth a permanent, silent O of loss. And the eyes. The eyes were dark, empty sockets, twin voids of bottomless despair that seemed to drink the very light from the air. This was no mere ghost. This was the raw, concentrated essence of a pain so profound it had refused to die, a grief that had festered into a monstrous physical thing. It raised its long, thin arms, and from the black hole of its mouth it unleashed a shriek. It was not a sound of this world. It was a sound of pure, undiluted agony, a sound that carried the crushing weight of a century of loss, a mother's unending scream for her stolen child. But woven into the sorrow was a new and terrible note, the screeching, violent rage of being thwarted, of having its prize snatched away at the last possible second. The sound tore through the air, a physical force that vibrated in my bones and made my teeth ache. It felt like the air itself was ripping apart, and the lake responded to its master's cry. The calm, placid surface erupted, From the spot where the creature shrieked, the water exploded upward in a violent churning geyser. A wave, impossibly tall and black, rose from the depths, a wall of freezing, churning water that crested and then crashed down, roaring towards us. The time for thought was over. I lunged forward, grabbing Leo by the front of his jacket, my movements driven by pure, unthinking instinct. "Hold on!" I screamed, turning and pulling him with all my strength back towards the shore. The icy wave hit us like a physical blow, a battering ram of liquid cold that knocked us off our feet and plunged us under. The darkness was absolute, the cold so intense it felt like fire burning all the air from my lungs. I held on to Leo with a death grip, my arms screaming in protest as the undertow tried to rip him from my grasp. We broke the surface, gasping, choking on water and air. I found my footing on the slick, rocky lake bed and began to fight my way back, dragging Leo with me. Every step was a battle, the water a thick, heavy enemy that sought to pull us back into the depths. Finally, my feet found stone instead of mud, and I scrambled backward, hauling my son out of the water and collapsing onto the sharp, unforgiving rocks of the shoreline, my body a single, shaking knot of exhaustion and freezing cold. I lay on the sharp, wet stones of the shore, my body a single, shaking instrument of cold and exhaustion. I held Leo tight against my chest, his small form trembling violently, his face buried in my shoulder. I could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of his heart against my own. I pushed myself up onto my elbows and risked a single glance back at the lake. It was perfectly still. The surface was a placid, sunlit mirror, betraying nothing of the violent, monstrous rage that had just erupted from its depths. It was calm, it was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. There was no thought. There was only instinct. "Run!" I rasped, my voice raw. I hauled Leo to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. "We're running. Don't look back. Do you hear me, Leo? Do not look back." He nodded, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. We turned our backs on the water and scrambled away from the shore, stumbling over rocks and through the muddy ground of our ruined campsite. My only goal was the tree line, the spot where the path had vanished, where our escape had been denied. We reached the edge of the woods, and I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It was there. The path. The clear, well-trodden trail of dark earth and flattened pine needles was back, winding its way into the trees as if it had never been gone. The impenetrable wall of thorns and branches had vanished, erased as cleanly and supernaturally as it had appeared. The forest had trapped us, and now, for reasons I couldn't begin to comprehend, it was letting us go. The realization was not a relief. It was a final, terrifying display of power. We were not escaping. We were being released. That thought propelled us forward. We ran, a frantic, stumbling flight through the woods. Every snap of a twig behind us was the creature. Every shadow was its form. The silence of the forest was no longer empty. It was the silence of a predator that had lost its meal, its gaze following us with a cold and patient hunger. We didn't stop until we burst from the tree line and saw it, the familiar, metallic glint of our car. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the door open. We threw ourselves inside, and I locked the doors with a convulsive, final click. The roar of the engine was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I slammed the car into reverse, spun the tires on the gravel, and we sped away, leaving Echo Lake to its ancient, sorrowful secrets. The weeks that followed were an exercise in deliberate forgetting. We returned to the loud, chaotic, and wonderfully normal world of traffic, television, and takeout. The city's noise was a blanket we wrapped ourselves in, a constant static that helped drown out the memory of that profound, watchful silence. We never spoke of the trip. Not once. The muddy, discarded camping gear remained in a heap in the corner of the garage, a foul-smelling monument to a memory we refused to acknowledge. On the surface, things were normal. Leo went to school. I went to work. But at night, the cracks in our fragile facade would show. I would wake up from nightmares of dark water and a sorrowful song, my heart pounding. And Leo became terrified of the dark. And he refused to take baths, standing by the tub and just staring at the still water with a look of pure, unadulterated fear. We were survivors, but we were both deeply, irrevocably scarred. One Tuesday night, weeks later, the illusion of normalcy felt almost real. I was tucking Leo into bed. The house was quiet, the only light coming from the small cartoon character nightlight in the corner of his room. He was already half asleep, his breathing soft and even. I pulled the covers up to his chin, a wave of fierce, protective love washing over me. In that quiet domestic moment, a relic from our old life, I did something I hadn't done in months. I started to hum. It was an unconscious, automatic gesture. A simple, comforting tune. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Leo's reaction was instant and violent. His eyes flew open, and his entire body went rigid, flinching away from me as if I had struck him. "Don't sing, Dad," he whispered, his voice sharp with a terror that was completely out of place in this safe, warm room. I stopped immediately, confused and hurt. "Hey, what's wrong, buddy? It's just a song." But he wasn't looking at me. His wide, terrified eyes were fixed on the dark square of his bedroom window. It was black glass, reflecting the dim light of the room but also showing the impenetrable darkness of the night outside. I followed his gaze, my heart beginning a slow, cold drumbeat. I listened. Over the distant, muffled hum of the city, I heard it. It was so faint I was almost sure I was imagining it. 2 notes. The first 2 notes of the lullaby, clear and pure, hanging for just a moment in the night air. Before the 3rd note could form, the sound was completely, utterly obliterated by the rising wail of a passing ambulance, its siren tearing through the quiet. The siren blared, passed, and then faded, leaving behind only the normal, meaningless sounds of the city. I looked back at Leo. He was still staring at the window, his small body trembling. Was it real? Or was it just a ghost in our minds, a shared trauma we would carry forever? I looked at my son's terrified face, and I knew it didn't matter. The monster had been left behind at the lake, but it had sent its echo with us. And for us, the silence would never be empty again. The story ends there, in a quiet room, with a question that has no answer. The monster was left at the lake, but the nightmare, it seems, has just found a new home. The father's only weapon was the truth, fighting an idealized memory with the messy, imperfect details of a real life. What would you have done to break the spell? What memory would you have used? Share your thoughts and your fears in the comments section below. I read every single one. If this tale left a chill down your spine, the greatest way to support the channel is to hit the like button, subscribe to Horror Stories Audio, and ring the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss our weekly descent into madness. Sharing this experience with a fellow horror enthusiast is the best way to help our community of fear grow. Until next time, remember that some memories are not a comfort but a cage. Be careful of the silence. It's never truly empty. Sleep well.